Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion. I'm thrilled to be here and was delighted to be asked to chair this session. I'm Professor Fiona Skillen, and I work at Glasgow Caledonian University. My area of research is the history of women's sport in Britain. And this morning, I'm joined by three excellent panellists for what I hope will be a very exciting and interesting discussion. We're not having formal papers this morning. It is a discussion panel, but we are going to be talking around certain key themes. And then we will be opening the floor to questions. So please do feel free to pop your questions in the chat. And if there's time at the end, we'll get through as many of them as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to do some introductions. We are joined firstly by Jess Hartsom, who is an illustrator, and she will be drawing throughout this session, but also throughout the conference, and capturing, hi Jess, and capturing some of the points that we'll be making. And then those illustrations will be shared with delegates at a later date from the conference. So very much looking forward to seeing those, Jess. I've seen some of your work before and it's really fantastic. So thank you for being here and being part of our discussion today. Our panelists this morning, we have Professor Wray Vamplew, who's an Emeritus Professor in Sports History at Stirling University. We have Professor Mike Huggins, who's an Emeritus Professor at Cumbria University. And we have Professor Richard Cox, who is, again, one of the founding fathers of sports history in Britain. So we're really excited that all three of you could join us this morning. So thank you for being here. And I'd like to start with a very broad question, which is, how did you start in the field of sports history and heritage? And maybe start with Richard, if that's okay.
Right, well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Justine, for inviting me to the conference. I think perhaps not unusually, I was first attracted to sports studies to understand and enhance my own personal performance as an athlete. But when it sank in soon after that I wasn't going to make the big time, I became more interested in the wider issues of why and how people engaged in sport, both historically and cross-culturally. When I embarked upon doctoral research in the mid-1970s, it was still virgin territory, and without knowing what might exist to conduct and evidence my research, I spent a lot of time exploring potential source materials. As it happened, this became my overriding obsession as I became excited by the vast array of material I discovered, much of it outside the scope of my doctoral research, but supportive of a whole new range of topics and approaches to sports history that I or others might one day explore. Many of these records were hitherto largely unknown, mainly because they were found as part of larger collections like the Mass Observation Archive, the History of Advertising Trust, in relatively obscure and private collections such as clubs, schools, stately homes, sports good manufacturers, law firms, and some remarkable avid collectors. It was often relatively inaccessible and in vulnerable locations such as lofts of clubhouses, boathouses, the lofts of homes of ex-officers, etc. So in the hope that this would promote future research, I embarked upon the mammoth task of listing what I discovered. This included published secondary and primary works, manuscripts, works of art, and even collections of artifacts and sporting memorabilia. I created several databases, and by the turn of the millennium and my retirement from academic life, I'd amassed a bibliography of 22,000 publications, a library of over 2,000 books, a chronology of what I regarded as the 2,000 most important events in the history of British sport, and masses of photographs, articles, and theses. Incidentally, I also was involved in setting up the British Society of Sports History and some of the initiatives we got up to through that organisation. But keen to promote the collection, preservation, and exhibition of this source material, I encouraged individuals clubs and organisations to deposit or somehow safeguard their records and collections, and in so doing get them indexed and made more accessible. At the time, I encouraged record offices to be more actively involved in collecting records of sporting organisations, as they're traditionally done with civic and industrial company records. And the resulting new accessions I listed annually in the BSSH bulletin. Those who had already acquired significant material, I encouraged to promote awareness of it via listings and exhibitions. As a result, in 1982, we saw the Sporting Surrey exhibition mounted by Surrey Record Office, Sporting Prints by the British Library. A couple of years later, Sporting Trophies by the V&A Museum, the entry race course to set up a sport mural of venue, and the Liverpool club to sponsor Echoes of the Cop oral project.
Oh, I think we're kind of losing Richard there just a little bit. Is everyone else?
I'm losing him too, yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
Richard, I think we've lost you, Richard. So maybe we'll come on to Ray, because you're next on my screen, and give you the same question, and we'll come back to Richard when he's able to join us.
Thanks, Fiona. You'll gather that the word emeritus professor has applied to me and Mike means we're very old, and therefore we're part of sporting history and heritage ourselves. I got involved in sport history in the mid-70s. I'd been an economic historian, and I got interested in the economics of horse racing, which is a peculiar industry, and I published my first book in 1975, The Turf. In the 90s, I got interested in sporting heritage and wrote a survey article on sports museums in the Journal of Sports History. And then shortly afterwards, I wrote some critical articles on London sports museums and St. Andrews as a golf heritage centre. And a few years ago, I had to put my money where my mouth was, and I became consultant for the European section of the Qatar Sports Museum in Doha for the FIFA World Cup. I then apologized to all the museums I criticized, because I realized what a horrible job it was. It was an absolute nightmare trying to produce a museum when there are very few artifacts available. And I've also been involved in public history. I was a writer of the official history of the Professional Golfers Association.
Brilliant, thank you, Ray. We'll come on to Mike now, and then we'll come back to Richard.
Well, I didn't get into sports history at all first. I worked as an educationist, and I worked with teachers and children and schools and all sorts of things. But I also did work with museum educators and blue badge guides, and that taught me two things. And the first thing was, unlike academics, the importance of story. You know, so story is so central to sports heritage. I think a good story makes up for a lot of things. And the other thing that I learned from working with teacher educators and so forth is that the people, our clients in sports heritage, learn in different ways. Some love to read. Academics love to read text, but lots of folks shy away from text. Some folk want to look at things, so they like to look at pictures sometimes. Sometimes they want to look at films. And of course, if you go into a museum where the film's long, folk watch the first bit and then walk out again. So the length of the film is important there. Some folk like handling materials, you know, some folk like doing things, and some forms of physical activity. And some like to listen. So and oral history comes in there. So that, for me, that sense of sports heritage needs to tap into all those in different ways. And if we don't do that, we're losing part of our client base. And then I got into sports history, which was quite late. And it came in nearly as about the same time as Fiona, I think, at the beginning of the 20s. And since then, I've written or edited about over 100 books, articles, books, chapters, and so forth. But my approach has always been not to just look at the sort of written text, but I've always enjoyed using more the sort of unexplored, sources and so forth. I'm thinking of things like paintings. I've done a lot of work on paintings, on film of various sorts, and newsreel, and I've looked at comics and cartoons and dialect poetry even I've looked at, and music hall song, sporting gravestones. I've ranged very widely over the whole range of different sources, and that's been quite deliberately, because I've always felt that there's been for a long time was a huge obsession with text, and that's how I got into sports history, Fiona, in a few sentences.
Absolutely. No, and that's fascinating. I think all three of you have touched on some really interesting things, and I'd like to follow up on a couple of those. So what do you think were the biggest challenges when you were first starting out looking at sports history and the kind of emerging field of sporting heritage? What were the biggest challenges facing sporting heritage as a kind of sector as it emerged, do you think?
I think the biggest challenge has always been funding. We can talk about all the other things, but in essence, to do well in sports, in sports heritage terms, you have to find funding, and funding has always been hugely difficult, I think, for sports history. We spend far less in Britain on heritage and the arts than most European countries. We have to spend a lot of time on applications, and I suspect in terms of funding awards, I'd love to know the spatial distribution. I suspect there's a big tendency for focus on not on Scotland, Fiona, or even the north of England. My suspicion is it's markedly on the south of England and more prestigious heritage. And the commercial sponsorship is a challenge too. Because any commercial sponsorships, it's short term, and all these funding bodies have their own agendas too. And I know if you look at the Museum Development Northwest website, there's lots of lists, but you still got to access it. And that, to me, if we could find the funding, we could do far more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, it occurred to me, when the sort of limited stuff that I have done in by comparison in sporting heritage, the other challenge that I've noticed is that there's this expectation that sport itself should be paying for its heritage and funding its own museums. And I wondered if that's something that you've come across, that kind of that tension as well, that perhaps doesn't exist in other museum sectors.
Can I answer that one? Or
of course, yeah, really.
I think there's a lot of tension because sport wants to have a good historical past. Sport wants to be remembered for what it thinks it was rather than what it actually was. So they don't like the nasty stuff. So they don't like us to examine discrimination that much. And when it's celebrated discrimination, it's the overcoming of discrimination.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The first woman to do this, not the 199 women that we never gave jobs to. Or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, is that a danger around kind of nostalgia as well, Ray?
Yes,
that,
it is.
We're kind of that rose-tinted look back and only remembering the good times.
Can I merge those 2 points, Fiona?
Of course, yeah, Mike.
I take Ray's point because, of course, I've done quite a lot of work on match fixing, and that side which we also always describe as corruption, and yet it's always been a normal part of sport. Drug taking has always been a normal part of sport, but when you're looking at sports heritage, it's almost impossible to address that because, first of all, most academics want to address it, and secondly, most of our clients don't want to address it either. So you're in a double mind if you want a balanced picture, and I in a way I suspect we partially need to accept that. How far we need to accept that is a different question, and that whole notion of nostalgia is part of that. I agree we should preserve the past, and I take that point absolutely. But one of the questions for me has always been, what kind of past do we want to preserve? And that's quite a nice phrase. Yes, we want to preserve the past, but what kind of past do we want to preserve? And nostalgia, I think, in a way, I remember Fred Davis wrote a book on the the politics and the sociology of nostalgia, and he said it could be a denial of the past and of the future.
Mm. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I guess from my own perspective, that's very much the case, that even in the kind of good sports history museums, often it's been the case until relatively recently that women's voices are missing or are very marginalized within those narratives that are being promoted within these spaces. So I think you're right, Mike, that whose heritage do we want to promote? What stories do we want to promote? And that's constantly changing, as it should be, and that should be reflected back within the institutions as well. Ray, you look like you wanted to come in there?
Yes, I think we've got to think of something which I call intangible sporting heritage, and that's the attitudes that have become ingrained, particularly in sporting bodies, like carrying amateur values over into professional era, like resisting change, because we've always done it this way. And that's as much sporting heritage as the artifacts we talk about.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And it's an important part of that, isn't it? It's an important part of maybe starting that discussion about how things should change, or why they should change, or why they are the way they are, but that's not necessarily always the best thing. I think that's important. Richard, did you want to come in here?
No, an issue that I think is also important, and that is that I don't think within contemporary sport there's always the sort of respect or recognition of the importance of its heritage. Sport, having sort of worked for 20 years at the coalface of modern competitive sport as a sports scientist, I found that many practitioners were not really interested in the past. It's all about the here, now and future. And anything that, when I tried to sort of talk about things that had happened in the past that I felt relevant to the present, they didn't sort of gain any recognition.
Do you think that's something that's changing, or is that something that's still very much the kind of case now?
Well, I think in the wider public it's changing and there is a greater recognition, but I think if you were to speak to consult current Olympic coaches and athletes, very few are really interested in the history. I mean, as an example, I worked in modern pentathlon for 20 years, and somebody wrote the history, but they really struggled to sell copies of the book to anybody, currently involved in the sport.
Absolutely. Mike, did you want to come in?
I think one of the challenges is that nearly all sporting bodies suffer from two difficulties. The first is that the officials are nearly always from the previous generation, and we tend to forget that. So if you look at the FA, if you look at the critical organizers, many of the officials and the folk on the committees come from a previous generation where things were different.
Yeah.
And we're looking at now. And the other thing, of course, is that all of them now have commercial imperatives. And because they have commercial imperatives, they're faced with different challenges, which often they don't really understand, or some of them don't understand. And I know when I was working on match fixing and some of my previous papers on that, when you talk to all the current organizations, they've all got integrity units now. That notion of integrity is central, and because they're anxious that if they don't have integrity in the sporting results and so forth, then that will affect the market. But they at the same time they don't want to publicize this. And that worry about commercial imperatives means that immediately they're looking at sporting stories about the past which support the present and possibly support the future. And that's quite difficult, I think, for them.
Absolutely. And I think also when you then factor in the demands of the fans, if it's a particular type of sport where there's a fan base that's coming as well. I'm thinking particularly of, halls of fame. There seems to be a kind of often a bias towards contemporary figures recently retired figures being entered into halls of fame rather than historical figures, because those are the people that are within living memory that people can relate to and can recall going to see that person playing or achieving whatever it might be in their field. And so again, there's that natural bias towards the present and lived experience and memory. And I guess that's something that kind of links in with your work, Ray, as well, around halls of fame.
Well, I think fans
halls
are
of fame. Sorry, you go, Richard. Sorry.
Okay, I think fans are a very special group because, you know, they take a very nostalgic approach. They want to sort of eulogize, worship their heroes. And in the research that I did into visitor interest, they weren't really interested in the wider sort of educational contextual issues. They just wanted to go and recall and celebrate, you know, famous victories or individuals. And some of the sporting halls of fame and museums in North America, they have almost a sort of church-like setup with stained glass windows and almost altars that these fans go to sort of worship their heroes.
Absolutely.
And so they're a very specific group. I don't think they're a major group, but I don't think they're representative of, you know, their views are very limited compared to the wider public.
Yeah, and somebody's just put in the chat as well that linking those 2 points about fans and the commercial kind of side of things, there's also the media and the kind of media fanning the flames of that as well, and being interested in promoting contemporary stories and contemporary sports stars with a nostalgic focus. And that perhaps also is part of the challenge for the museums as well, because they know that will get publicity and it'll get footfall for the museum as well.
But therein lies the danger of them misinterpreting events. You know, if you look at Chariots of Fire as an example, they were perhaps less interested in historical accuracy than attracting, you know, drawing attention to a good story.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Ray, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think one of the issues is not that people do false history that much, but they do history by omission. And I think of 2 examples. If you're a Celtic fan, you're brought up with this idea of Celtic was started as a charitable foundation to help the poor in the East End of Glasgow. They don't know that within 10 years they turned professional, become a limited liability company, paid dividends and no longer gave any money to charity, and even demanded that when they played in charity matches, their players got paid. That gets omitted. I remember when I looked at the Chelsea Museum, Football Museum, when it first opened, there was no mention whatsoever of the shed, the infamous shed, the most violent spectators in Britain. Barbed wire was put up over the goals to stop them getting on the pitch. Now, this was ignored, but as a historian who studies sports violence and crowd behaviour, it's a vital part of their history.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and again, that's something that's come up in the chat. Somebody has just said that it's something that they are starting to grapple with within their sports museum, some of these difficult stories and how to tell them. So maybe that is something that conversations are starting to change around. What do you think are the significant changes in the sporting heritage sector since you first started to study it?
Fiona?
Yeah.
Can I just think about America for a moment, because I've been
Absolutely,
to America I've been to America quite a lot, and what you see is there, I think, is that every sport, every major location has a sort of has its own museum, its Hall of Fame, or its local memorials. But increasingly, more and more of these are going online. While in Britain we still, you know, often think of actual sports, you know, locations. In America, that notion of online sports heritage is much bigger, I think, much bigger than it is in the UK at the moment. And it's another thing, of course, that we have to think about, because increasingly museums too are having, you know, are going online. They're introducing blogs. Where was it? Sheffield has a walk around all the, you know, you have a walk around all the sites of early football in Sheffield. There are all sorts of different ways of doing it, but much of that is now it's virtual, it's online, and it's another thing I think that we need just to think about, because at the same time, one of the other blogs I noticed talks about visitors, and of course sports tourism is yet another part of the story of sports heritage, because, you know, people go to our sports museums, but they don't necessarily go to learn a huge amount about sport. They're there. It's partly another aspect of modern entertainment. And you don't necessarily go there to learn a great deal. You go there for the experience, to look. Sometimes you look in an informed way. Some people look in a totally uninformed way. But it's all part of the pleasure of the visit. And somehow we've got to come to terms with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that comes back again to what we were talking about earlier about audience, doesn't it? So who is the audience of the museum, and how do you meet their expectations? And often I think what we're seeing from this conversation and across the sector is that there's often many audiences for this type of museum. And that's challenging. So in terms of changes in the sector, you touched on, Mike, there, digitisation and kind of online provision as well. That's a huge change that's occurred, being led the way, I think, very much in America. But I wondered if, Richard, that kind of links in with what you were talking about earlier, about the challenge of locating artefacts and preserving those artefacts and making the records and so forth accessible. You know, do you see this as a good thing, that this move towards digitally preserving and sharing these types of materials?
Well, I think employing technology has got to be the way forward. I think that the days of certainly general sports museums is no longer valid. I think that they can't work commercially, and I think that because of the different interest groups, people want to dip in and out where they want. So if they're interested in their particular club, they're happy to go to a museum or centre or exhibition that has a strong identity with their local community, but not to a physical place which covers sport as a whole. And so I think, you know, the future is in outreach programs via the internet, and the employment of interactive type games and activities that will attract those and communicate with those wider audiences. And I mean, it's interesting to see on Facebook, for example, the many discussions there are of the greatest goal scorers ever, or the all-star Liverpool team of the 20th century, etc., etc. And lots of people are engaging in that. And I think that's quite healthy in one way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Ray, did you want to come in here, or?
You were asking about changes. I think one thing that I've noticed is that perhaps sporting heritage is looking more at the non-elite side than it used to do. I mean, we talk about halls of fame, that's one example. I think there's a lot of sporting heritage, particularly when it's replicating events that have happened, taking sport heritage out to the community. I think they've been looking lower down the socio-economic scale in participation than just the elite of the Hall of Fame variety.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Mike, did you want to come in here?
No, I don't want to add that particularly, except in the sense that, you know, people are sometimes involved in actually donating things to museums as part of that, you know, community link. But my worry about this is another theme which we really haven't touched on yet, which is that sports memorabilia and the increased cost of it all. My sense is that at one time, you know, museums could get material quite easily, but people are now much more aware. If you watch Antiques Roadshow or Bargain Hunt or things like that now,
Yeah.
all this, you can see how sports memorabilia now has a real commercial value. There was something I watched the other day, I'm ashamed to admit. There were a couple of rugby league shirts from the Wembley final with winners' medals worth about $2.5 grand, you know. So museums can't afford to get that sort of thing at all. And the same's true of films. Yeah, I've done a lot of work on film and on newsreel, and but recently you have to pay to access it rather. I did some work on topical budget newsreels for a company recently to provide an overview of his coverage of sport, which sounded very, very interesting. But of course, if you want to read my stuff, you have to pay for it. You know, and so if you want to use these films now, you have to pay for them. If you want to use Pathé News or or go to the British Film Archive, I remember being able to use it free about 15 years ago. But now you have to pay to use it. You know, I did a film on the pools companies a few years ago, but you can't watch it unless you pay for it. You know, and that I think that's the difficult. With libraries and museums having decreased funding by and large. You know, university libraries have ever decreased funding, museums have ever decreased funding. These collections have to be catalogued, that costs money, they have to be maintained, digitization slowing down. I think it's becoming very, very difficult to actually build up those sort of collections, which at one time were quite easy. Folks don't want to give them in the same way they once did.
Well, I think some people now see them as an investment for their retirement, and I've been shocked by the size and scope of some private collections. You know, some very wealthy individuals have built buildings in which they've housed a library and a fantastic collection, in one case of motorbikes, and I don't know I don't know whether they will be able to sort of raise funds when they need them from those, and what the future holds for all those materials that have been collected. But I certainly doubt that museums will be in the market to be taking them on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of points there, Mike, that are so interesting. I mean, I think one is obviously the digitization and the costs associated with those sorts of things. You know, we know the sector is under a lot of financial constraints, so it's maybe not surprising that some of these things are now being monetized and charged. But I wondered if, you talking about Antiques Roadshow and so forth, and the recognition that some of these things now are valuable, have a value, a monetary value rather than just a sentimental value or a historical value. Does that make us a victim of our own success? That we've changed that discourse, that people now realise sport's important and should be preserved? I don't know.
I think that's right. I think people understand that the past, to put it bluntly, the past has a price. And that notion that the past has a price means that people now see it. People see things in there that they've got as not just meaningful to them, but meaningful to a wider public, and therefore the wider public should pay.
Yeah. Do
you think museums should allow replicas rather than actual artifacts?
That's a controversial one, isn't it? I mean, that is, I'm aware of some museums that do that, of significant cups and things so that people can get photographs and so forth. And I can understand from a preservation point of view the reasons why they do that. But as a fan, do you really want to hold something that isn't the real thing? For me, the excitement is knowing I've held something that, some other historical figure has held or has been at a significant event. And we were already getting people coming through the chat saying, definitely not, under no circumstances should we be doing that. So we're going to come over to the chat in a minute. So if you have questions, do pop them in. What do you other gents think about that, about replicas in museums being used?
You see, I come from an educational background, Fiona, so my view is rather different. I think for a lot of people, even if it's a replica, that you know, if I could hold Seb Coe's winning medal, you know, where he's beaten everyone in his school, everyone in his, you know, university, everyone in his county, everyone in the country, everyone at the Olympics, even if it's a replica, that sense of holding it in my hand has a resonance that really seeing it in a picture, seeing it on a, you know, seeing it behind the glass. It may be a replica, but it still has potency, it still has power, and it still has pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I suppose that's also where some of the sporting memories work as well. Often those are replicas that are being used when they're being taken out to work with groups, and it's not necessarily about the object themselves, the physicality, the fact there's a history behind it. It's about the memories that it stimulates and the feelings that stimulates. So absolutely can understand that. Richard?
Well, going back to the sort of early 1980s when Soccer City exhibition was staged in Liverpool, obviously it was important to generate a number of income streams, and one of them was actually selling replica trophies, you know, just miniature ones, and people bought them, so that they certainly have some value to individuals who think it worthwhile paying the money and taking them home and doing whatever they do with them, you know, presumably putting them on the shelf.
Or wearing them to do the dishes, or who knows? Who knows what people get up to in terms of their own homes. But absolutely.
Can I just make one point?
Of course.
What Mike was saying about corruption in the past, there's also corruption in sporting artifacts now.
Yeah, I guess.
How do you know this is the genuine article? How many tennis rackets does a star player use in one game? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess it goes with the course, doesn't it? It's that kind of where there is money, there will also be people trying to make money in different ways. So we have a lot of people commenting. There's actually the chat has been, I don't know if you guys have seen this. There's been a lot of stuff happening in the chat. So a lot of people agreeing with things that you've been saying. I won't go over all of it, but I have a couple of questions. So we're going to start with one here from Sassy Holmes, who said, I think it's interesting to scrutinise why your museum might not be using original collection items for engagement. Why can't visitors or groups hold or engage with an actual object? And what are the organisation's reasons for doing that? So I think we've kind of touched on a little bit of that, but I don't know if there's anything that any of you would like to add to that about examples perhaps that you've come across in your own research. Or perhaps not.
There's the Flemish Sports Museum use modern versions of medieval apparatus so that people could actually hold them and try and work out how they were used. Because all we tend to have is pictures of them in use, but they're static. You don't get the dynamic element.
Yeah, and I suppose there's an opportunity there for people to try the sports and activities as well. So that can be quite exciting. We've got a couple of things coming up now. So Jed Smith has said 2 different things that are being discussed here. Replicas being used for handling or photo ops, fine. But putting a replica behind glass, does that undermine everything that we do?
That's a good question, I think.
Yeah.
I think if it's displayed on the glass, the message always is it's the original. And if not, it should be made very clear. I think as long as it's made clear that it's a replica, I have no problem with that at all. You know, but if you go to a museum and you're handling things, I think you're advised to handle originals. You're far better off handling replicas. But I have to say, I've been across a lot of Europe when I've been to conferences in Europe, and I've visited sports museums there. By and large, many of them do more handling of artifacts than we do here in Britain.
Another question that's come up is, have you come across competitors or organisations who don't see any value in their sporting items, documents and photographs? And, you know, have you got stories around changing people's opinions of that?
Not from me.
No?
Well,
Richard?
when I was involved in undertaking a survey in the early 1980s, it was interesting how some organisations, and one that comes to mind is the 3As, all that they could show me was a metal cabinet with some old trophies in, and a few minute books. And yet I know individuals who've got far bigger collections of literature and statistics programs, etc., associated with the history of the sport. But then there are some even small clubs who did have quite extensive collections and had, you know, taken a serious approach towards preserving them.
Absolutely.
I wonder if there's anything that can be done via tax status, because in America, you get, the individual gets the tax deduction back from a donation to a museum. In this country, it's the museum that gets the extra money.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That perhaps that is something worth looking at. Although I guess I presume the museum.
I may be wrong. I've never paid tax. So
yeah. You've not got a secret multi-million collection somewhere that we don't know about, Ray. So we also have another question that's come in the chat. Let me just open that up. So the question from Gary James is, I'd like to ask the panel, what does the sports museum of the future look like to them?
I wonder if there'll be any sports museums of the future.
Okay, in a bleak sense, Ray, you think they're not economically viable, or? Okay.
Well, certainly, I'll put it this way: I doubt it'll be a sports museum of the future in Britain.
Okay, yeah.
I think Mike's right that other countries look after their artifacts and history, sporting heritage and sporting history much more than we do. Yes,
I agree with that. I think that the challenge is that on the one hand, we want responsible guardianship for all our collections and things, and we also need to future-proof them to a certain extent. But it's very hard in the current climate to know what the future is likely to be. Because people are facing new technologies, virtual realities. You know, we can now create a completely fake Fiona Skillen to walk around the room. You know, but
what a horrific thought.
but you take my point. You know that the technology is changing. So by asking me to predict the future, the one thing I've learned from history is that you can't predict the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, on a positive note, we have Jed Smith in the chat, who is joining us from, I think, Australia, from Melbourne. And he said that sports museums in Australia and New Zealand are kind of bucking this trend because they're growing in number and increasing their visitation numbers as well. So that's really positive. And I guess I'd like to know more about that, Jed, about what's happening in Australia, who's investing in these spaces. But yeah, Richard, sorry, you look like you want to come in here.
Well, when you look at what's happened over the last 40 years, there's been an enormous growth. When I looked at the list of delegates for this conference, I was quite surprised to see that so many organisations had now engaged the services of an archivist or were engaged in heritage projects. In the early 1980s, you had the Wimbledon Museum and Lord's, and that was it. So I think the small ones that are associated with a particular club or venue do have a future, but I think their appeal will always be quite limited. I don't expect them to have wide appeal, and so I think it's for the bigger museums who have got active education programs to sort of take on board sporting the themes and to engage that wider public through the opportunities that new technologies offer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I pick another point up, Fiona?
Of course, Mike. Yeah.
I'm thinking here. One of the things about sports heritage is it's naturally, I think, fairly present-centered in its approaches to the past heritage. It has to be, because we're responding to current demands and current clients. But the challenge, I think, is that there are, as well as the changes in technology I've mentioned, there are also changes in fashion. And if you think about that, for example, we've had the Sporting Statues project, which largely features people within living memory. But at some point, all those folk won't be within living memory anymore. And of course, fashion might mean a change from the statues. The question might be what we do with all those statues that no one remembers anymore. And that whole sort of constant change means that we can't just rely on present sporting heritage. We've got constantly to be moving forward, because there are new markets, there are new clients, there are new generations. There are a whole series of things are going to come up, which mean that that's another reason why I can't predict the future, because of that change and the constant changes, as I say, in fashion, in changes in technology, mean that we can't future-proof what we're doing at the moment.
Yeah. And you'll also have 30 years more sports history to look at.
Yes, also true, Ray.
That's a very positive way of looking at things. We also have a comment in the chat from Raf Nicholson, who says that in her view, it's really important for us to have independent funding available for sporting heritage initiatives, so that there can be that kind of distance from the sporting organisations, the sports themselves, the individual clubs, because there is a danger of those organisations perhaps being less willing to embrace the kind of warts and all type history that we've been talking about here as being so important. Would you guys agree with that?
I think there's a balance to be drawn, isn't there? Increasingly, I know that public funding is in decline as governments are less and less willing to produce it, and therefore private funding is moving up. But then with private funding often comes demands for accountability to the funder, and that can shape the sort of sports heritage that you then produce. Yeah. And I think that in itself becomes yet another challenge. Yes, I can see the argument that and she's right, that we do need that sort of funding, but it's not necessarily independent. Finding it totally independent funding in any field, frankly, has always been quite difficult. Yeah, it's a wish. I agree. Whether you can make it a reality in a lot of cases, this is probably much more difficult than we realize.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, my point would be, how would it be in the interests of, say, Liverpool Football Club to be promoting anything other than a sort of nostalgic approach to fans to celebrate all their successes? That they're not interested in telling any other stories, and why should they be?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, but I suppose there's also an element of it's an opportunity for education or to open discussion as well. So I'm just thinking of let's say a nameless large football club in Scotland that's just opened a museum. And when I was talking to them in the kind of early processes of developing the museum, I raised the question of sectarianism, and their faces, they just went very pale, as if like, this is not something we're going to engage with at all, even though it's absolutely fundamental to Scottish football, to the organisation itself. Is very much associated with that, even though that's something that they perhaps don't see. But nonetheless, they could have taken a kind of objective perspective on that and saying this isn't something we endorse. This is an opportunity for us to put forward our view on that and to start that conversation with fans who come to the museum. But as far as I'm aware, and I've been to the museum now twice since it's opened, there is no mention of the kind of elephant in the room. So
history by omission again.
Absolutely.
Yes. I mean, is not one of the problems is that sport heritage is not sports history.
Yeah.
sports history is finding out what happened in the past, understanding what happened, if you like, analysing the past. Sports heritage is remembering, commemorating and preserving sporting history, replicating the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It might be too sweeping, but it's a few.
Absolutely.
I can live with that. I think, Ray. I think
Yeah.
probably is it. Simply because I always balanced education and academic history, and I work hard at my academic history, but I understand there's another world out there, and in a way, sports heritage combines a partly imagined past and a partly imagined authenticity. But that's how it works.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one final question. Somebody has asked in the chat, does the club shop count as sporting heritage? What do we think?
Only if it charges 1920s prices.
Nice one, Ray. I like that.
Yeah. Okay. Only if it sells retro tops and yeah, those kind of things, retro balls and things. We're getting lots of laughing emojis, Ray. So that's a good sign. There are people out there who are still listening to us. So that's great. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity then to close our discussion, to thank our panelists very much for what has been, for me, certainly an incredibly enjoyable hour, and I hope for you too that are listening. Thank you for all your comments and the questions in the chat. It's been great to see how active you've all been engaging with the session, and I'm sure our panelists will enjoy looking back over those comments later on. It just remains for me to remind you that after this short break, our next session is going to be looking at, it's the first of our studies of showcasing different sports museums and sporting heritage engagement. So please do come back for that. And if I can just thank you all for being here, and thank our panelists once again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.